Well, good morning. You are listening to National Real Estate Auction Radio. I am your host, Doug Dennison, and we are broadcasting from beautiful St. Augustine, Florida, the nation's oldest city, at WFOY 1240 AM studios. Through the power of the internet, this program is being streamed worldwide on www.1240news.com. The show will also be archived on www.rowlauctions.com, they are the sponsor of the show. And also, we're going to try to put it on YouTube, www.youtube.com. We are going to talk about real estate auctions, past auctions, upcoming auctions, different real estate markets across the country. We have lots of topics today, and to help us out, we have 6 or 7 real estate and auction leaders calling in today. Let me go over our schedule and a few things about the people who will be calling in. We have Stanley Tate going to be calling in. He's the CEO of Tate Enterprises, the former RTC head from North Miami, Florida. We have Randy Morris, who is the CEO of Insight Commercial, which is in Detroit, Michigan. Michael Fay, who's the president of Colliers International in the Miami, Florida office. Marla Webb from Prescient Asset Management, which is a FDIC contractor. John Lewinger, who is founder of Grubb & Ellis Commercial in New Mexico, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Walter Liff, who is the CEO from Action Auctions in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And we have Tommy Rowell, the president of Rowell Auctions from Moultrie, Georgia, be calling in. So we're gonna be calling in a lot of people who are basically leaders and experts in their field. About our sponsor, Rowell Auctions is the national real estate auction leader that started in 1936. They do online auctions, on-site auctions, and ballroom auctions. They have offices in Georgia and Florida and have alliances with auctioneers and real estate brokers across the country. They do government auctions, bankruptcy auctions, and much more. They have a big auction schedule coming up, so check out their website on www.rowlauctions.com. That's www.rowlauctions.com, or you can call them at 800-323-8388. Again, 800-323-8388. We've got a caller, and let's go right to him.
Good morning, Doug.
Stanley.
It's Stanley Tate.
Hey, how are you doing, sir?
I'm just doing fine, thank you.
Well, very, very good. Thank you so much for calling in and being the first guest of the show. And I wanted you. I went after you, and you said yes. So thank you so much.
And it's a pleasure to be with you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. You were the former RTC head, and for listeners, what is the RTC? What was the RTC, and what were you charged with?
Well, the Resolution Trust Corporation, which is what the letters RTC stands for, was a federal act under the guidelines of an act designated as FIREA. It was a federal reform act having to do with the savings and loan problems with the savings and loan banks. Initially, it expanded its program and its efforts to take in commercial banks as well. And it was designed to eliminate certain types of banking operations that caused a large number of problems in many banks throughout the country, primarily federal and state chartered banks. And it was very effective. The bill allowed it to last a lifetime of 5 years with 2 one-year extensions on petition to Congress. And it had a lot of power, and primarily to close a bank. If the RTC felt that a bank was uneconomical and had risks of defaulting on its commitments and its deposits, the Resolution Trust had federal authority to go in and close the bank.
Okay.
So it was a very effective organization. It actually did what it was charged to do. It closed 1 out of every 4 savings and loan in the United States. It went after bankers that did illegal acts, not unethical, but illegal acts.
Right.
them through the criminal court division of the federal government, and actually put a large number of bankers in federal penitentiary. And it was a very effective and well-operated organization, which in fact did save the banks that were in trouble, eliminated a large number of operations that bank had undertaken in the feeling they had that right. I think it was more of an opportunity than a right. And it effectively sold off a substantial amount of assets, took over the banks, sold those banks. It had the authority to take over under the legislation. That authority was given en banc, meaning the entire banking system was covered, and they didn't have to. The RTC did not have to go to Congress to get permission to close a single bank. They had the authority in a broad brush format, which gave them the right to go in on a Friday, close the bank. In fact, we closed approximately 1,400 banks.
Wow.
Several hundred of those were commercial banks, not savings and loans. But that essentially was its right, authority, and it was extremely effective. It cured the problem. It did extend its lifetime to the 2 one-year extensions, but essentially it got rid of $430 billion worth of assets, and it did what it was supposed to do under the federal guidelines.
Well, you know, this show is intended for basically an educational experience for listeners and a promotional format for auctions across the country. And you had involvement with auctions, and basically I'm going to say the RTC put auctions in the minds of buyers and sellers and brokers across the country for several years. Give us a little history on that.
Well, as you probably know better than most, I was extremely reluctant to utilize bankruptcy as a form of cure and auctions as a form of cure. And I think primarily in hindsight it was because of my lack of knowledge of how effective an auction could be. The purpose in taking over these banks was not to preserve the asset, but to sell the asset. In order to sell an asset, it's a much more effective tool to utilize an auction. I didn't believe that to be a fact, but it is. And in actuality, the Resolution Trust proved it was by the large number of auctions that we handled through auspices of various auction companies. And I must say, Mr. Dennison, you of all people ought to have a good memory of what took place when the RTC was getting its feet wet with auctions, because I dealt with you and I said to you, it won't work, you won't get the amount of money and all the other things, and you stood steadfast in your opinion that I was wrong, and of course then you proved me wrong. So trial by error is what succeeded in getting auctions a way to dispose of a substantial amount of assets owned by the Resolution Trust by taking over or disposing of assets of troubled banks.
Well, I want to talk about that one auction that we did together, and it was one of the first ones for the RTC.
You want to embarrass me?
No, I don't want to embarrass you.
You know I'm kidding.
I know that. But one of the things that you were, I finally convinced you to do the auction was a bank building in Miami Beach. It was kind of a small place, but right on Washington Street, if I remember correctly. And
Washington Avenue, I'll never forget it.
Washington Avenue. And one of the reasons why you decided to have an auction is because you did have interest, but you weren't sure on what was the proper value of the property, number one, and number two, every one of the offers were different. Some were with financing, some weren't, some had a lower down payment, all that kind of stuff. So we talked together, and you agreed to an absolute auction, which means absolute. It sells. There's no tomorrow. So if you're interested, come to the auction that day. And if my memory serves, we had almost 15, 16 bidders there. It was appraised, I think, at the time about $450,000. And because of the competition, the final price was $1.3 million. And it was, again, a great auction, a great way to start auctions for the RTC. And you became a believer.
Well, it was a great way to start auctions for the RTC because the property sold for substantially more money than the absolute price because it was intensive bidding.
Mm-hmm.
I think the prep work in the auction was to a great degree responsible for the activity. My concern, of course, was that either no one would bid or that the starting prices would be so low we couldn't afford to sell it.
Right.
And that's how we turned it around into an absolute auction where there was a minimum price. I mean, you might as well take the credit for convincing me that was what was going to happen. I doubted it. As a matter of fact, I more than doubted it. I was pretty well convinced it couldn't happen, that it wouldn't sell for the amount of money we established as an absolute minimum price. And the activity of the bidders drove the price up. It actually sold, if I remember right, for about $300,000 more than the minimum. Active bidding was sold without financing on an all-cash basis. And the interesting part, and you don't know this, Doug, but the guys who bought it was a group, said to me it was probably the best buy they ever made, which was interesting because they were absolute real estate buyers. They wanted this particular building for a particular purpose, but I must tell you, it was a lesson that I don't forget so easily, and that's primarily because I had no knowledge of how auctions worked. But the prep work in an auction is a very important part of it. The manner in which the auction is handled, how many participants are actively involved, how you set it up, how well you handle the closings. I mean, all of the things that we learned after that first auction, when I walked away convinced that auctions was a very valuable and solid means to dispose of assets. You've got to understand that the Resolution Trust Corporation only was attempting to get the highest and best price and get rid of the asset.
Right.
And because of that, the auction did both. It got rid of the asset, and it established the highest and best price. And invariably, in many, many instances, we got monies in excess of the minimum bid. So I'm a believer.
Well, I know you are, and I appreciate that. Let's fast forward now, many years later. And again, we're kind of in the same situation, but maybe even bigger than certainly it was back then. Tell me I talked to you yesterday. You've been up in Washington. What are you doing up in Washington? And I think you even told me that CNN interviewed you a couple of days ago. Tell me what's happening up there, and how do you give your perspective on what's happening in for our markets, the residential, commercial, and the economy today?
Well, essentially, I gave a speech to a very large group of professional real estate people, some bankers, a large number for prospective purchases of real estate. I would say the group that was comprised of about 400 a little less than 400 individuals, but they came from very high-level companies that were in the real estate business for many years, either as developers, operators, purchasers, syndications, you name it, they were there. Mm-hmm. The speech was really having to do with the status of the real estate market currently, broken down into two primary categories of residential versus commercial. And we talked about the status of the market today as it relates to distressed property on the residential side, and whether or not it was bottoming out in spite of the fact that financing was not very much available. The commercial banks were not lending money so easily. And the other part of it that we talked about was the general economy of the United States and the concern that I expressed of the huge amount of debt that the country had accumulated in the last few years. And we're on a pathway of deficit spending. And I was concerned that we already were at $14.3 trillion, and we were exceeding the allowable amount that the federal government was allowed to borrow. And actually, as you are more aware than most, today it stopped. That the federal government can't borrow anymore because it reached that maximum level of borrowing. So it's before Congress, and Congress has to make a determination as to whether or not they're going to allow the federal government to borrow more money. Mm-hmm. If they don't allow it, if no bill is passed, literally the federal government is shut down. Wow. I know that sounds a little hard to believe, but it will be shut down if the Congress don't take an affirmative action. Now, in order to prevent it from being, we've already reached the date where it had to be done. They extended it first for 2 weeks, and then this past week they extended it for another 3 weeks. But I could tell you there won't be any more extensions based upon the conversations I've had with members of Congress. The Republicans are absolutely adamant that there's going to be a reduction in the current year's budget, and the Democrats have taken a strong position that entitlements have to be recognized. Entitlements meaning contractual entitlements, pension plans that the unions may have organized are large, and some very valid, some not so valid. But in any event, that's the two positions, and they're diametrically opposite each other. And compromise is going to have to come about in order for Congress to resolve that issue, because it must be resolved, or believe it or not, the United States government, as an entity that is very involved in the business community, will be shut down.
Well, Stanley,
it's hard to believe, right?
It is hard to believe, and I could probably talk to you for the entire hour if I could grab all of your time. But I want to thank you so much. Again, folks, this is Stanley Tate, CEO of Tate Enterprises in North Miami, Florida, a leader in our banking system and owner of banks. And Stanley, thank you so much for calling in. I appreciate it.
Doug, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I thank you for asking me to come on your program, and it's always a pleasure to be able to once again renew a very good friendship that came about from an auction of a bank many, many years ago.
Thank you, Stanley. Take care.
Thank you, Doug.
Bye-bye.
Bye.